Good afternoon. My name is Sonora Monks, ESA's Director of Programs and Education. Thank you for attending today's webinar titled U.S. Energy Storage Monitor Second Quarter Summary. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at www.energystorage.org. Participant lines will be muted throughout the webinar. However, we welcome your questions and comments, which can be submitted at any time via the chat box on the left side of your screen. Following the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording and slides, as well as a brief survey regarding today's topics and topics for future webinars. Your feedback will ensure that ESA continues to provide the highest value information to you and your company. Today's speakers are Brett Simon, who's Energy Storage Analyst with GTM Research, and Dan Finfoley, who's a Senior Analyst with GTM Research. And now, since I know we all want to get to the content, without much further ado, I'll turn it over to Brett to begin today's presentation. Brett?
Excellent. Thank you, Sonora, for that great introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Brett Simon. I'm a Senior Analyst at GTM Research. My primary area of coverage is the U.S. behind-the-meter market, and my colleague Dan, who you'll be hearing from in the second half of this presentation, covers the front-of-the-meter market. So that's just to give you a little bit of perspective on our relative backgrounds. So just quickly giving an overview of what we're going to talk about today. The slides in this presentation are some highlights from our quarterly report, the U.S. Energy Storage Monitor, that GTM Research publishes in collaboration with ESA. This latest iteration was just published a little over, or about a week ago, and has a variety of topics that it covers. So today we're going to look at some recent deployment trends in the U.S. market. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some market drivers that are pushing this market ahead, and lastly conclude with our market outlook. So jumping right into deployment trends. The slide does not appear to be showing. Okay, you got it? Cool. Great. So just to cover the recent deployment trends in the U.S. market, Q1 2018 was actually down 39% year over year. In Q1, we had 43.6 megawatts deployed. Now, it may seem disheartening to think, oh, the market declined 39% year over year, but it's a bit misleading to be depressed about that year-over-year decline. And the reason for that is that Q4 2016 and Q1 2017 were actually anomalous for the reason that they saw the deployments from the Aliso Canyon procurements. For those of you who may not be aware, there was a gas leak at the Aliso Canyon natural gas storage facility in late 2015. A state of emergency was declared, and one way to deal with the upcoming capacity shortfalls was to procure and install energy storage systems, front-of-the-meter energy storage systems, on an expedited timeline. Those systems came online mostly in Q4 2016, but a fair amount of capacity was deployed in Q1 2017 as well, which is why you can see that there's such a massive size of the market for the front-of-the-meter market in those two quarters. Additionally, the market declined a little bit, or declined 30% quarter over quarter as well. The market was about 62.1 megawatts in Q4 2017. Again, there's no real reason to be alarmed. The fourth quarter of every year tends to be a larger quarter, and the first quarter tends to be smaller. Now, really one of the things, though, to be excited about in Q1 that's a bit masked when you just look at the total numbers is that Q1 2018 was actually a record quarter for the residential market in the U.S. In fact, almost as much residential storage in megawatt terms was deployed as front-of-the-meter storage, and furthermore, almost as much residential storage was deployed in Q1 2018 as the entirety of 2017. So that's a really exciting thing that's happening. There's a variety of underlying drivers there. One being changing net energy metering rules, which are leading to more folks adopting storage for self-consumption of solar. Another is changing utility rate tariffs, where with more time of use rates, residential customers are turning to storage. Furthermore, there's also still the emotional play of customers who are just interested in adopting storage because it seems like a cool toy to have in your garage, or there's an interest in having storage for backup. These are all things that are coming together to help push the residential market forward. And just anecdotally talking with players active in the residential market, they've seen really large increases in recent months in their deployments and also in their pipelines. So expect to see more residential storage coming down the pike as well. And of course, we can't discuss the storage market without talking about both megawatts and megawatt hours. As I'm sure most of our listeners are aware, when talking about a storage system, you have to be concerned both with its power capacity, or megawatts, as well as its energy capacity, or megawatt hours. And so here we see that the market declined 46% year over year. Again, that's entirely attributable to those Aliso Canyon projects, most of which were in the 4-hour range. And because quarter over quarter, the market actually grew 26%. In Q1 2018, 126.3 megawatt hours were deployed, while in Q4 2017, 100.2 megawatt hours were deployed. And this mainly was the result of all the front-of-the-meter systems deployed in Q1 2018 having a 4-hour discharge duration. So those systems really helped push up the Q1 2018 megawatt hour numbers. Furthermore, when we're looking at the behind-the-meter share of the market, it's not as large for megawatt hours as megawatts, because the behind-the-meter systems tended to be more in the 2 to 2.5 hour range, as opposed to, again, those front-of-the-meter systems, which are in the 4-hour range, leading to the behind-the-meter market to account for 49% of deployments in megawatt hour terms in this most recent quarter, Q1. So let's dive into what were the largest individual state markets in Q1 2018. And I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone here to see that California is the leader for both residential and non-residential markets in Q1 2018. That's from a variety of factors. I already mentioned changing net energy metering rules and utility tariffs, with time of use rates becoming standard in California in the not too distant future. But furthermore, California also has the self-generation incentive program, which is a very attractive schema whereby storage, among other technologies, can claim an incentive, and thus, that's been a big piece of pushing the market forward historically and continues to be. Additionally, in the non-residential market, a fair amount of those projects are also part of some utility procurements for some of the various capacity programs explored by the utilities. And if we dive specifically into the residential market, the second largest individual state market is Hawaii, which had about 2.2 megawatts deployed in Q1 2018. And together those two markets make up a large share of residential deployments. But also worth noting that all others category is fairly sizable. What we at GTM Research do is we track 10 individual markets: Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, PJM, and Texas, with Colorado and Nevada actually just added to our state coverage this most recent quarter. And so those all others markets are individually quite small, but collectively were the second largest for both residential and non-residential. And that's from the fact that, again, we're seeing this increased demand for storage, in a lot of cases for emotional plays. We've heard anecdotally from installers active in the Northeast and Southeast that a lot of their customers want storage for backup purposes, frequently because customers are concerned about natural disasters such as hurricanes knocking out their power for extended periods of time. In the Northeast, Hurricane Sandy is still on the mind, whereas in the Southeast, there was a very aggressive hurricane season last year, and folks are still concerned about such things going forward. When we look at the front of the meter market, here the market this past quarter had a single state leader of Arizona, and in terms of the all other markets, that was at the number one slot. That was actually led by Florida. And you'll also note that number 3 for front of the meter was Hawaii with a single small project that was actually a flywheel pilot project in Hawaii. But we expect more projects in Hawaii in the future that will likely be significantly larger. And so let's talk about technology. When it comes to storage, technology is always a significant concern, just given, thinking about choosing the best technology for the job or thinking about technology cost or performance when selecting a system. As I'm sure is no surprise to most of our listeners, lithium-ion once again held a stranglehold on the market in Q1 2018. Lithium-ion technology has had greater than a 94% market share for 14 straight quarters and shows no signs of abating. Lithium-ion battery costs have declined precipitously over the last few years as manufacturing has scaled up, as there have been improvements in the technology, the ability to pack more capacity into the same size battery. Innovations continue in the lithium-ion family of chemistries. Though, what I will note is that what we've also been hearing is that there might be a slight reversal of the lithium-ion battery cost decline trend in the second half of this year. We actually expect there to be a slight increase in lithium-ion battery costs late in 2018, just given the fact that there's been high demand for energy storage systems, and much of the existing production capacity has already been committed to contracted projects. However, this won't be a long-term problem. There's going to be more battery manufacturing capacity coming online in the not-too-distant future, particularly in Asia. Much of that will be scaling up, and the question is not simply, if it will come online, just when, in terms of that temporal cost element. In terms of the other chemistries to talk about, lead acid came in second, which has a small market share. Lead acid still remains a fairly attractive technology for off-grid deployments, though I will note that the deployments we track here are grid interactive, so these don't include any off-grid or UPS. And also, as I noted on the previous slide, there was also one very small flywheel project that was also included, but worth calling out that there are electromechanical technologies as well as electrochemical which are being deployed in the storage market today. So investment is another piece of the market that frequently comes up and is something that we track internally at GTM Research. And corporate investments in storage reached $223 million in Q1 2018, all of that coming from venture capital investments. And this represents a VC investment growth of 60% over Q4 2017, though total investments were actually down 5% from Q4 2017, given that there was some project financing activity in the last quarter of 2017. And the largest single deal that we saw in Q1 of this year was an $80 million Series D round raised by STEM, who is an active behind-the-meter storage developer. Investors in that round included Temasek Holdings, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and Active Capital. And then there was a rush of M&A activity in 2017, but 2018 has been a bit quieter on that front thus far. In Q1 2018, one deal was Peterson Dean's acquisition of Haleakala Solar, which is a battery storage and solar installer active in the Hiko territory of Hawaii. And then in May 2018, which wasn't Q1 but still was before the publication of this report, Shell acquired a majority stake in GI Energy, which has previously done some storage development work. However, these two acquisitions' value was not publicly disclosed, and thus their values are not included in the above chart. So I'm not going to harp too much on the specific numbers for these battery cost trends, but the important thing here to note is that we continue to see some declines in battery cost trends over time, but in some cases, the declines are either not as rapid or some prices are in fact holding flat. So, for instance, 2-hour front-of-the-meter systems declined 8% quarter over quarter. whereas other technologies, the median remain mostly flat overall. And that's coming from things that I already mentioned in terms of manufacturing capacity scaling up, but also in some cases from soft cost reductions, improvements in installation, companies getting more familiar with how to deploy these systems, contributing as well to some of those cost declines. And similarly with the behind-the-meter prices, the non-residential median declined by about 3%. Residential has stayed mostly flat with a slight reduction in the top. Given economies of scale, the front-of-the-meter system prices have just tended to decline much more rapidly than behind-the-meter. But behind-the-meter systems still are projected to have some pretty attractive cost or price declines in the not-too-distant future. That said, let's jump into some market drivers. So every quarter, GTM Research does a deep dive into a topic of interest, which we call our In Focus section in the full report. We've covered a variety of things, everything from FERC proceedings to different corporate activities. And most recently this quarter, we looked at solar plus storage system architectures. The fact of the matter here being that there are different possible architectures when you are installing a solar plus storage system. You can either go with a DC coupled system, which tends to be economically superior for new installations, just simply because you have a storage system and solar system that are sharing sharing an inverter in a lot of cases, whereas and the storage system only charges directly from the solar system, allowing you to guarantee the investment tax credit, whereas AC coupled systems generally are preferred for retrofits or in a lot of cases for C&I systems, just given the opportunity to charge either from the solar system or from the grid. The solar plus storage market is growing pretty rapidly in the U.S., and that's why it's so important to investigate these types of questions. The annual market is set to reach 2.2 gigawatts by 2023. Changes, and again, going back to changes in net metering programs and declining storage system prices are influencing the growth of this market. Solar installers and developers are continuing to expand their business models to include storage. A lot of these installers and developers are shifting to focus less on simply installing solar and more on offering a suite of energy management technologies, among them storage. Furthermore, major utilities are pursuing solar plus storage in long-term resource planning. For instance, recently, Xcel Energy announced 560 megawatts of solar paired with 275 megawatts of storage in a recent procurement. Utilities are thinking more long-term about modernizing their grid, and in a lot of cases, they're seeing pretty attractive opportunities from solar paired with storage on a price basis. Some key states to keep an eye on for solar plus storage going forward on both sides of the meter are Arizona, California, Hawaii, and Massachusetts. And we expect the behind-the-meter market to make up 67% of solar plus storage capacity by 2023. And in terms of how the solutions break down between AC and DC coupled, AC coupled solutions dominate the market today. There simply are more of them available. This is from the fact that, again, a lot of these legacy projects either were retrofits or were looking at a storage system that needed to be able to independently charge from either solar or the grid. Though, however, we have seen an increased popularity of DC coupled systems. More players are adopting these systems going forward. And particularly for the front-of-the-meter market, we expect a lot more adoption of DC-coupled solutions in the coming years, simply from the fact that there's this economic opportunity to take the ITC and to store more and to deal with the issue of solar clipping that can make these architectures more attractive. To even give one anecdotal example, I moderated a panel at the Energy Storage Association conference a little over a month ago. And on the panel, it was a solar plus storage panel, and most of the panelists were from the front-of-the-meter solar plus storage world. I asked them, going forward, what they expected to be the breakdown of AC coupled versus DC coupled, and the consensus was, they expected going forward almost all their projects will be DC coupled. So something to keep in mind there. All right, so the last thing that I'm going to cover before I turn it over to Dan is to look at some of the recent behind-the-meter policy developments. I'm, of course, not going to read off every individual development on this slide, but I'd like to talk about a few key trends that are quite interesting. One being incentive programs. So there have been a few successfully implemented solar or storage incentive programs. However, recently there have been a few struggles. Bills recently failed to pass in Florida, Hawaii, New Mexico, and Virginia. However, on the plus side, the New Jersey State Legislature is looking, or rather the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities is looking to restart the Renewable Electric Storage Incentive Program for fiscal years 2019 till 2022. So keep an eye on that. I believe the comment period closed recently, so we should have more clarity on that in the not too distant future. Additionally, we're seeing more utilities think about how they can employ behind-the-meter storage. Green Mountain Power continues to be a leader with behind-the-meter systems, looking at deploying and leveraging residential systems. We see the California utilities continue to be leaders as well. In Arizona, the Salt River Project, SRP, launched an incentive program for storage, so that's quite exciting as well. And in Colorado, a bill was passed to streamline behind-the-meter storage interconnection rules and help remove barriers. And lastly, some long-awaited guidance came out in New York around lithium-ion battery installation and permitting. There's long been challenges with installing lithium-ion batteries in New York City, given concerns around thermal runaway and risk of fire. But FDNY, DNVGL, CUNY, NYSERDA, and the Department of Buildings recently released guidelines for outdoor lithium-ion storage in New York City, and we expect more guidelines in the coming months for lithium-ion systems installed indoors. That said, I've done a lot of talking over these last 20 minutes, so I'd like to pass it over to Dan to finish up.
Thank you so much, Brett. All right, everybody, so let's go ahead and come out from behind the meter and step into the sunshine of the front of the meter policy and market developments. It was another eventful quarter. There really hasn't been an uneventful quarter for the past couple of years here in the front of the meter energy storage space. Q2 2018 was no different, and once again, I may sound like a broken record if you tune into these webinars multiple times in a year. We're looking at mandates, IRPs, and ISOs. These are three of the main areas that are driving excitement in the front of the meter policy and market space. Diving into IRPs really quickly, integrated resource plans, there's increasing pressure from legislatures, from utility commissions to make sure that utilities are considering energy storage in their IRPs. This has some really significant upside for the energy storage front of the meter market because these IRPs are long-term, meaning that there's an opportunity to create a market over the next 10 or 20 years as opposed to 2 or 3 years. In addition, these utility investments generally come with some great degree of certainty and can spur some pretty significant deployments into the market. Some of the notable ones I wanted to point out were Colorado, which coincidentally, as Brett mentioned, we were just starting to track independently in this monitor on a project level. They passed a bill which would require the Utility Commission to investigate the merits of and potentially implement a requirement that storage be included in all utility IRPs in the state. What's amazing about the energy storage market right now is this was published a week ago, and it was maybe being finalized in the past 2-3 weeks, and this is already practically out of date. We have massive activity from Excel in Colorado implementing a ton of solar plus storage projects for rock bottom prices. So clearly the utilities, at least one utility there, is already on board with this idea. In addition, in Arizona, you had the Arizona Corporation Commission, which is sort of the utility commission for Arizona, rejecting the state utility integrated resource plans, essentially saying that they didn't consider the correct things and potentially relied too much on natural gas, to the point where they put a temporary moratorium on natural gas infrastructure over 150 megawatts. There are caveats there that say if you go through the process, if you submit various requirements, you can build a plant if it's deemed necessary. But since it's only a one-year moratorium through 2019, it's pretty much effectively shutting off new natural gas for the next year. This is a trend that has been filtering through a lot of different markets as natural gas and storage not necessarily directly compete, but begin to intersect in a way that is a bit more dynamic than what we've experienced in the past. We see that especially in California, and we expect that trend to continue, and this was something that we discussed last month at our natural gas versus storage conference, which really came out to be a natural gas and storage conference. These two technologies have a lot of opportunity to work together. In addition, you're looking at more updates to mandates or goals, targets, mandates, however you really want to define them, and I'm sure the wording matters quite a bit as to how they're implemented and actually enforced. New Jersey is the latest one to implement a mandate, and based on a criteria where you compare it to the overall size of the electric need for the state, it's one of the larger mandates that have been proposed or passed or implemented on a ratio basis significantly larger than California, Oregon, New York's, and nearly on par with Arizona's proposed 3 gigawatt mandate as well. In addition, there's a Senate bill that was just announced in Massachusetts this week that would implement a 2 gigawatt energy storage target there. Legislatures seem to be tripping over each other practically to try to implement aggressive energy storage targets. A lot of other updates here, including utility activities, lots of activity, of course, in New York as REV proceeds. But the real highlight that I'd want to bring up, which I have before and will again, is, of course, FERC Order 841 and its little brother that nobody particularly noticed, FERC Order 845. These orders have the potential to influence a massive subsegment of simply markets in the United States. Every organized market outside of ERCOT falls within the jurisdiction of FERC, and 841 essentially dictates that the playing field be leveled for those projects. Go ahead to the next slide. Looking at some of the nuances to this rule, there's a lot of area where ISOs have a significant amount to catch up, and not every ISO is starting this race at the same point. PJM, CAISO, they've been implementing energy storage in their markets for a long time. CAISO's non-generator resource model is continuing to be seen as the model to follow for other ISOs that are adapting their market mechanisms to include energy storage. There are markets, however, that are significantly behind the curve here, and I would point to specifically MISO and SPP. All the other markets generally have storage participating in their market successfully in one form or another, and are actively pursuing modernization efforts or implementation efforts to make sure that energy storage has a participation model that complies with FERC Order 841. SPP and MISO are a little bit behind the curve, SPP potentially even more so, but every ISO is going to have to do something involving FERC Order 841 because of the multiple requirements that it has that we've laid out here. For instance, just that last bullet, a minimum size requirement that does not exceed 100 kilowatts. There are several ISOs that have very effective energy storage participation models, but a 1 megawatt minimum. They're going to have to adjust that. Making sure that energy storage participates at the LMP. There's issues with self-scheduling versus automated scheduling there as well. These are a lot of things that every ISO is essentially going to have to work through and solve, but the leeway of each individual ISO is pretty broad in how to implement this. There's no direct requirement that the ISOs completely overhaul their mechanisms for participation of resources in general, but simply make sure that energy storage is eligible to participate and that it is the unique operational characteristics of energy storage are accounted for, physical and operational characteristics. For instance, the fact that it is an energy limited resource and the fact that it is quick responding resource, etc. This has huge upside for the market, but it's actually not as exciting to me as it may have been at first blush. Obviously, this opens up a market that's billions and billions of dollars in terms of the total energy and capacity markets that are operating throughout the United States across these ISOs. Just a staggering amount of money is out there. But just the fact that the playing field is level doesn't mean that energy storage can hop in and immediately win in these markets, competing as it is. In a lot of these markets, costs are going to have to continue to fall for energy storage to compete by offering some sort of single revenue stream such as capacity or energy arbitrage. Particularly energy arbitrage, we need to see some significant changes in how the price signals are, how the highs and lows are behaving before that becomes viable. But there's a lot of optimism in the industry that this could open up a pretty significant amount of, this clears the way for innovation, essentially. Because you have certainty into how you interact with all these wholesale markets, you're not guaranteed to win. You're not even guaranteed that these markets are going to have a good clearing price. But you are guaranteed that you will be able to get out there and play. And because of that, if you have an energy storage system, you're no longer worried about whether you have potential revenue streams in Massachusetts moving forward. You're not worried about whether the market's going to dry up because all of a sudden storage won't be eligible. I do want to bring up FERC Order 845, which almost has more near-term effects. The 845 essentially confirms that energy storage is part of a facility, which for tax reasons has a couple of benefits, but also really helps with co-siting wind and storage and solar plus storage in terms of how storage can participate in these markets. It could be a pretty big boon for developers who already have a pretty significant number of sites that have operating wind and storage. And as always, those sort of hybrid facilities are increasingly becoming an exciting opportunity. So, taking all of the market drivers that we've been discussing together, I'll dive into our market outlook. But first, since I'm on the front of the meter side, I thought I would walk everyone through our pipeline. Now, this is completely distinct from our forecast, which is what we actually see the markets doing over the next 5 years. The pipeline is simply a raw collection of projects that we have seen announced or under construction in the United States during that quarter. So as projects fall off this list, they're removed from interconnection queues or they're announced that they won't move forward, you'll see the pipeline shrink. As projects are added to the list, announced through RFPs or appearing on FERC forms, etc., you'll see the pipeline grow. A couple of quick points to make is that California was really the dominant force in our pipeline, one of the leading markets in front of the meter storage for a long time, and a very large portion of this pipeline was made up by the California interconnection queue. A lot of those queue requests are speculative. You may have 10 projects announced. You might have a project announced and have 10 interconnection queues from people bidding on that project, for instance. So we would only expect a fraction of this total number to be installed. But whenever California's interconnection queue released a new cluster application, say between Q1 2016, Q2 2016, or again between Q1 2017 and Q2 2017, we saw big jumps in terms of the total pipeline. In the 2017 instance, we actually saw a lot of those projects in the California interconnection queue technically falling inside Arizona, which is why Arizona's queue jumps up so quickly. Some of those projects very large and very unlikely to move forward. But this past quarter was the really exciting one. California's interconnection queue plummeted, which was expected. We expected a lot of these projects that had announced 2019, 2020 commissioning dates to not move forward. So we expected this contraction. But the surprising part was all of the other markets rose up to actually fill in the gap. Specifically, Massachusetts, SPP, and MISO, along with New York as well. Essentially all the places where we're seeing excitement build over FERC Order 841. Again, these are still speculative projects. It could be people simply reserving the right to pursue an energy storage project depending on how the market participation rules and the market clearing prices filter out. But it's pretty amazing to think how much the California queue shrunk, and yet other markets are now rising up to meet it. This is a trend that we're continuing to see of diversification of the front-of-the-meter energy storage market. The first phase was PJM, with a big boom in the frequency regulation market there. Second phase was large 4-hour systems in California, specifically the Aliso Canyon procurements, and phase 3 appears to be basically everywhere. And that's going to filter down into our forecast, which I'll get to right now. For our energy storage forecast, we expect that the market itself is going to grow by a factor of 17 from 2017 to 2023. The market's going to approach the 1 gigawatt threshold annually in 2019, and then it will cross it quite dramatically in 2020. This is a big inflection point. You can see that there are kind of two. This is the first quarter that our forecast has shown a bit of a deviation from a traditional smoother hockey puck into more of a tiered step system. And that's simply because a lot of these projects that have been announced have 2020 as the installation date. That's also the date when the FERC Order 841 is really going to be in effect and projects can begin to get speculative. That is the year that California is requiring solar for all new homes. A lot of RFPs have that as the commissioning date. Interconnection queue requests have it as the request date. There's a lot of indication that we're going to see a pretty significant step in 2020. And in addition, we'll probably see another particularly steep step in 2023 as we have the sort of 5-year out RFPs, those sort of projects coming online in that year as well. Behind-the-meter deployments are going to make up almost half of the market, 47% of the annual market in 2023, and that's following a bit of an increase in the pipeline for front-of-the-meter systems, with simply a lot of large-scale systems announced from Colorado to Nevada, a lot of projects being tracked to meet various mandates in New Jersey, Massachusetts, etc. And I should note that there is even upside to this, as the pipeline I showed you before and this graphic doesn't include the full announcement from Excel regarding the solar plus storage projects that they're going to have coming online in the coming years. From a dollars and cents perspective, we expect about a 14 times increase in the dollar value of the stationary energy storage market in the U.S. between 2017 and 2023. We expect that it's going to cross the 1 billion threshold, cross your fingers, in 2019. It's always a fun number when you can start saying with a B instead of an M. That's almost doubling the previous year, as we expect a massive influx of those front-of-the-meter systems, as I discussed before. 1 billion worth of annual value will be created between 2022 and 2023 as the market ratchets up its deployments during those years. So this is just scraping the surface of what's covered in our energy storage monitor, which we're always thrilled to put out quarterly with ESA. The table of contents here shows you what you would be looking at. Obviously, a few more slides than we were able to show today, including that in focus section on solar plus storage system architectures, which was some really good stuff done by my colleagues here. With that, I would like to say thank you once again for your time. Please remember to ask questions at the side as we transition into the Q&A. And regarding the energy storage monitor, I will open up the poll, and Sonora, you may be able to launch this if I'm not able to, asking whether you'd like to be put in touch with a GTM research representative to learn more about the full energy storage monitor report. So as an ESA member, of course, you get a discount. So if you'd like to hear more, simply hit yes. If you're sick of us already, you can hit no, no hard feelings at all. And then with that, we will move into the Q&A section. Please feel free to submit your questions, and we'll answer as many as we can. All right. So we've got a couple of questions already. Please keep them coming as we go through things. First one here, how will cobalt price affect lithium-ion battery costs in the near future?
Good question. So, I mean, cobalt, so I'll preface by saying that, cobalt constraints are always always something to consider. And, there is obviously the geopolitical risk when it comes to cobalt, just given that over half of the world's cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which it has had some, to say the least, has had some political instability and some human rights issues associated with cobalt mining. That said, increasingly we've seen players try to pivot away from cobalt, either reducing the amount of cobalt in their battery chemistries or in some cases try to eliminate it entirely. And that's a trend that we expect to see continuing in the future.
Yeah, I would say that the OEMs are definitely ahead of this. They're really investing significantly, as Brett said, in these alternative chemistries. If anything is going to cause a spike or a flattening, obviously prices continue to drop, but if they were to level off, I would say it would be pointed more towards supply constraints due to booming market, potentially South Korea this year, other markets in other years, sort of sucking the oxygen out of the supply of the energy storage market, rather than supply constraints upstream in the cobalt realm. All right, we've got a question about slide number 9, dollars per kilowatt hour for front-of-the-meter systems.
I just wonder if this viewer might not have seen the slide that does have front-of-the-meter system prices, which I'll go back to for a second. Slide number 8 does have front-of-the-meter system prices, so I hope this gives that viewer a chance to see them. I don't know, sometimes when moving through the slides, there can sometimes be errors on our part, and there might be some lag when we're going from one to another, so we might think we're on one slide, but we're on another. So I hope this gives you a chance to look at it, and I believe that these slides will be available after the presentation as well. So if that's the case, you'll be able to refer to it that way. Or I know for sure this is being recorded, so if nothing else, you can watch this again and just skip to the part with the pricing.
It should be noted that if it is a unit question where you're looking for US dollars per kilowatt hour instead of US dollars per kilowatt, we did recently transition away from reporting in kilowatt hours and reported straight into kilowatts. In terms of the duration of the systems, to convert back and forth, it's just a simple division. For the 2-hour systems, dollars per kilowatt, just divide by 2 to get to dollars per kilowatt hour. For 30-minute systems, just divide by 1/2, which is the same as multiplying by 2. And then you can sort of back out the dollars per kilowatt hour numbers from that.
Cool. All right, back to the Q&A. Asking about Tesla DC coupled solution. For additional details. I don't really have any additional details to share, just there's different solutions offered by different players. Some players only offer an AC coupled solution, some offer just a DC coupled, some offer both an AC coupled and a DC coupled solution. I will say my sense is that the AC coupled solution for Tesla is much more popular today, but yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. Are there any potentially significant energy storage policy developments on your radar for the remainder of 2018?
Ooh, good.
That's a great question. So in terms of the remainder of 2018, I would say one thing that we're keeping an eye on is the VDER or Vader proceeding in New York, which the value stack for standalone storage is supposed to be clarified later this year. So that's one. I would say also, I mentioned earlier the New Jersey BPU, the reinstatement of the Renewable Electric Storage Incentive Program. We'll have some clarity for sure, A, if that is restarted, and B, what the final level of appropriations are for that bill. Additionally, I'm excited as well. The SMART program in Massachusetts will kick off in the second half of this year, which is the new solar program and includes an adder for systems that have storage paired with them. So that is quite exciting for the storage market in Massachusetts. Dan, are there any other policies for 2018 that you want to mention that are particularly exciting?
Yeah, you covered most of the good stuff. I'd point back to FERC Order 841. The ISOs are pretty much all in the middle of stakeholder processes to actually update their participation models. If you want to know more, those are all publicly available online, and you can always join those and listen in and sort of share my suffering as they drone on and on about uplift payments. And that's going to be the next year sort of discussing how to implement this, and then the year after potentially slipping into there and then further implementing it. And then also look to see whether there's going to be any rehearings from FERC. They've told that process, which is I had to look that up as a legal term, essentially meaning extending the deadline for any sort of rehearing request or other proceeding there, which means that they're going to be looking into the opportunity to potentially hear some of the arguments that are being made. But in my experience, all these arguments were made back when this FERC order was a notice of proposed rulemakings, and the commissioners then didn't seem to be particularly impressed by them. So it's going to be the same commissioners who issued this decision looking at the rehearings. I don't see much really changing there. Aside from that, you'll have your smattering of IRPs and RFPs as well. One thing that I am excited to see is answering the question of whether storage is generation, specifically in Texas. As a completely deregulated market, the distribution utilities are not allowed to own generation, but they would love to own energy storage because they can use it as a T&D deferral asset, not install a lot of pricey transmission or distribution. That's going to be an increasing problem as you have a lot of solar being built out in Texas towards West Texas, and then of course you have a ton of wind in there anyway. There's going to be transmission and distribution issues that they're going to want to solve. And this is a precedent that's going to be increasingly important because T&D deferral, I think, is going to catch on as a very big application for front-of-the-meter storage moving forward.
Excellent. All right. Can you share some residential energy storage trends? Sure. So, just in general, the market is being led by California and Hawaii. California, there's a few pieces coming together, one being the self-generation incentive program, another being the shift to mandatory time of use rates coming under the net energy metering 2.0 program, which that's another piece of it, that net energy metering compensation rules are changing, which is going to encourage more folks to self-consume their electricity. I will say, anecdotally speaking, with installers who are active in the residential market in California, they've seen a huge increase in demand in recent months, and their pipelines are what they've told me is that their pipelines are quite healthy, so expect that market to remain strong. In Hawaii, you have the case where recently, well, I say recently, but it was actually a couple of years back, the net energy metering program changed to a new paradigm where there's kind of two ways you can now install solar under the customer grid supply program, which allows for export, but there's a cap on that program, or the customer self-supply program, which has no cap but no export is allowed. So customers on the self-supply program must either undersize their solar system, which usually isn't economically attractive, or install a storage system so they can self-consume. Hawaii is also going to be shifting to kind of a successor to that program, which in the successor there's going to be compensation around when you export, in which case that also will be good for storage because if you have a solar system, you can't really control what time of day you're exporting, whereas if you have storage, you can store your energy and then export at those times of greatest value. So that's just something to keep an eye on. Other residential trends, I mentioned earlier that there is this increased interest in storage for backup in the Northeast and the Southeast to deal with hurricanes. And just in general across the country, we're seeing, just folks in general thinking about more ways to leverage behind-the-meter residential storage. We've seen utilities like Green Mountain Power look at ways to, offer storage to customers and leverage that. In Arizona, utilities like APS and SRP have been investigating ways to encourage storage and possibly leverage it. So those are all things to think about with the residential market.
All right, we've got a question here on who is manufacturing DC-DC converters. I'm not really sure off the top of my head. Maybe Dynapower, I believe. But yeah, don't take my word on that. We have a inverter converter team here. You can always follow up with us directly. Our emails are in the slide deck, and we can put you in touch with them, who are the experts, and they won't have to pretend to actually know what they're talking about. I mean, I do that anyway, but it won't be as obvious in this case.
Yeah.
All right, and now we've got a question. How will the e-mobility theme impact storage? Ooh, I love it. A couple of different ways that I see this happening. Obviously, the stationary energy storage industry only exists because of the electric vehicle and consumer electronic industries. Those industries are the reason that lithium-ion costs have dropped so precipitously because of the economies of scale that have, that this industry has essentially ridden along with, a little sidecar into those industries. So e-mobility in general, I would say, would be positive for energy storage. In addition, as you electrify, that creates new problems, challenges, and opportunities for the grid. You have different usage patterns that energy storage can help address through capacity. You may have different peaks, different troughs, different market mechanisms, more consumption needed, etc. So overall, I'd say it would be positive. And one area that I heard that I think is a very exciting opportunity is for fast charging, and specifically how that interacts with demand charges. If you have a demand charge on your system and you're paying for the amount of power that you're injecting at any one particular moment, the maximum, and 10 cars come and park at your gas station and all, gas up, so to speak, at the same time, you're going to be dealing with a huge demand charge. A way of ameliorating that would be to have energy storage there, drawing off the grid slowly and then discharging to the cars quickly. So in general, e-mobility and storage, I'd say, yeah, 2 thumbs up.
Cool. All right, next question. How soon is lithium titanate tech going to mature into the mainstream? That I do not know. And actually, Dan and I have a colleague who focuses more on upstream storage. So that would be a question that we'd have to check in with her on. So I don't have a good answer to that. I apologize.
Yeah. Then we've got one with utilities trying to install storage and solar prior to 2020 when the tax breaks taper off. We still show large growth in installations after that time. Let's go ahead and hop back to the megawatt forecast. There we go. to show sort of what we're looking at here. Yes, there is going to be not so much a rush, but a movement towards solar plus storage to take advantage of the ITC, and that's part of what you see in that jump there. What's important to note is that even by 2023, on the front of the meter side, we only anticipate 1 out of every 3 megawatts that's installed being directly paired with solar. There's going to be a lot of standalone storage for transmission distribution applications, capacity applications. That's going to make up the lion's share of the installations, and that's going to continue to drive growth. In addition, the tax credit won't completely taper off. Through 2021, it'll still be at 22% instead of 30%, which is still pretty darn good. And then it flattens off to 10% rather than being eliminated completely. As the tax break flattens off, costs are going to continue to drop. So we don't really foresee the market dropping because of the ITC being drawn down to 10%. If it stayed at 30%, I think you would see more upside in this market. But for now, it's going to continue to drive implementation, deployments, and standalone storage is going to take over any gap that may have been dropped due to the ITC drawing down.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add in the behind-the-meter market is there's other mechanisms at work as well that are going to push growth in those markets. We're seeing ever more utilities shift to time of use rates, and that's going to encourage more customers to get storage, again, assuming that the deltas are wide enough between the peak and off-peak rates, but to best maximize the value from their solar system and on their utility bill. And furthermore, net metering programs are consistently seeing their compensation reduced or in some cases eliminated entirely. And these are trends that we expect to continue. I don't see any signs of these abating in the near future. So as net metering compensation tapers off, there's going to be a greater push for customers to self-consume any solar energy they generate rather than export it, which again will push them towards storage. And then I think another component to think about as well is the opportunity for storage aggregation. Dan was talking earlier about FERC Order 841, which has a lot of implications for storage participating in wholesale markets, and that doesn't just apply to front of the meter, it also applies to behind the meter. And we expect more developers to aggregate multiple systems, dozens or sometimes hundreds or even thousands of behind the meter systems to provide services to the grid in the not too distant future. And in those cases, again, that's another way for storage to increase its economic value.
Yeah, I definitely should have mentioned that in terms of policies we're excited about. One half of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking from 2016 that then became Order 841 was distributed energy resource aggregation. They eventually split that NOPR in two, went forward with the energy storage participation model 1, and are now doing technical conferences and such for the aggregation component. But that's going to happen eventually. Maybe not sooner rather than later. It could take some time to work out the kinks, but that will be huge upside. How do you see a rental business model versus buying fixed asset storage will be a game changer? Ooh.
Good question. I'm guessing by rental, this participant is asking about kind of like a leasing type of model. And we're already seeing that particularly in the non-residential market. In fact, in the non-residential market, it's dominated by third-party ownership. Usually it's not the end customer who owns a non-residential behind-the-meter system. They're leasing it from a company like STEM or NG Storage or Advanced Microgrid Solutions or NL or what have you. And so that's just in general, these end customers don't want the storage on their balance sheet. They just want to lease the system or have some other type of financing for the system and just use it to cut their electricity bills as best they can. Where I think there will be an opportunity for growth is in the residential market, which historically has been an early adopter market dominated by cash sales. But we're seeing more players like Sunrun, for instance, offering leases for residential solar plus storage. So that's another opportunity where a residential customer might say, well, I don't feel comfortable paying however many thousands of dollars to own this system, but I'd feel comfortable paying maybe, and I'm just going to make up a number here, this isn't a real contract number, I'd be willing to maybe pay $20 a month to have this system for backup and peace of mind, or maybe to cut my electricity bills to some degree. And Green Mountain Power is another example of doing it from a utility perspective, where they're also offering a way for customers to lease a residential storage system rather. So something to think about there, going forward with the behind the meter market.
You can't put a number on it, Brett. Now if they charge me more than $20, I'm going to be disappointed.
Yeah, well, I have to say some number. Whenever I say X dollars, I feel like people kind of get a little bit unhappy. So I feel like even if I'm just making up a placeholder number, it's at least gives them something.
Yeah, that's smart. That's smart.
All right, future of pumped hydro storage.
Yeah. So our forecasts, all of our methodologies here do not include pumped hydro. That is intentional because if you compare advanced energy, battery, flywheel technology, et cetera, to the pumped hydro market of installed systems, it's a drop in the bucket, pun intended. Short term, there isn't anything new coming on the horizon, and there won't really be anything for at least 3-5 years, something like that, even if there was speculation on it, just because the permitting process for a new dam or making modifications to an existing one is really just prohibitive. Medium term, let's say long term, you have a lot of other technology players who want to do sort of more modular pump storage or less geologically intensive pump storage, I suppose I would say. One of those companies just got an investment from Bill Gates' fund. I forget the name of it, but they invested in a shale pumped high-pressure water system. So that's something that you can look into as well. But short term, I don't see it having a big effect on the market.
Yeah. All right. What will deploy storage faster, a target program or programs like the Clean Peak Standard? What will deploy it faster? I'm not sure what will make it faster, but I think both are certainly important. I mean, the advantage of a target, right, is it's a number that is mandated. So assuming the number is sufficiently high, even if it's not sufficiently high, but you know the amount of storage that has to be deployed by a certain date. So there's a lot more certainty there, whereas my understanding of the Clean Peak Standard, and I fully admit I'm not as, I haven't dived as deep into the Clean Peak Standard, is that it's more about incentivizing storage in the market for services that it can provide to help ensure that carbon emitting resources are taken off the grid. So in that case, it's more dependent on what the incentives are for the storage system. So it's much harder to know exactly how much storage will result from a program like that. And it becomes more about how can you align the incentives. And in some cases, if the incentive is too low, there won't be as much storage as there would be in a flat target. But if the incentive is very high, you could see more procurement. So I think it depends widely, but programs of both types are important for the growth of the storage market.
Yeah, I would reiterate that, and it's sort of tough to say. And of course, it depends on the market. If you have a peak that is already co-occurring with a ton of solar generation, then you're already sort of meeting a peak standard, or you can have a really toothless mandate. They're both artificial mechanisms of requiring energy storage. The first one is simply direct artificial mechanism of requiring storage. The second one, implicit, because you need enough storage to make sure that you cover the peak. There isn't any sort of, you can create a market mechanism around that, which is what I think is going to lead to long-term business models as opposed to short-term bursts of deployments. But in terms of making a business model, it's easier to do that around a clean peak. So I pick clean peak. Plus, I think it's just more exciting than a simple mandate.
Cool. Well, it looks like we have one final question. Probably have time to answer it. Do lithium-ion batteries still have a lifetime of approximately only 10 years? I'm going to say yes, but. In general, most lithium-ion warranties I'm hearing about today for lithium-ion systems still tend to be around 10 years. The but that I'll put in there is storage systems' lifetime is also dependent on how often they are cycled. So if you have a system that is very rarely cycled, like for instance, say a backup system that you might only be, cycling a few times a year, that system could have a longer lifetime versus if you have a system that's, cycling multiple times a day, that system actually would likely have a lifetime of less than 10 years, possibly even far less than 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to just consider the number of years of the battery. You also have to think about how the battery is employed in the market and in what way is it charging and discharging.
All right, with that, I think we'll hand it back over to you, Sonora, although I do see that we have a raised hand in the webinar system, which I don't think I've seen before. So that could be a person with a question over the phone, perhaps.
Hi, guys. Yes, since participant lines are muted, we do ask anyone who has a question to submit questions in the chat box, and we will hopefully get to it. But it looks like we have about a minute left here. If I can do some quick announcements before I thank Brett and Dan for the time. I just wanted to alert everyone that we are going to be on Thursday, June 28th. We'll be doing a webinar regarding the second round of comments that are due for the NFPA 855 standards. The speakers on that webinar will be Steve Cummings of Nexeris and Chuck Foster, who is our technical consultant on this standard. The webinar is being offered to members complimentary. It's part of your membership, and it's for $39 to non-members. I'd also like to let you guys know, if you haven't heard already, we are going to be holding the third Energy Storage Studio Conference in collaboration with EPRI. This one will be coming to Charlotte October 16th and 17th, and we are holding our call for submissions now. So if you're interested in participating, you can go to energystorage.org/storage studio to do so. And actually seeing no further questions coming in from the audience, Brett and Dan, once again, I'd like to thank you very much for all the great information and great insight today. Thank you for always providing such wonderful information during this webinar. And thanks to everyone for attending. And if you have any other questions about upcoming events or webinars, or to submit an idea for a future webinar, you can always email me at s.monks@energystorage.org. And without further ado, I'd like to thank you guys again and wish you a good day.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was great.
Thank you. Always our pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.